All of a sudden it doesn't like my little blankie. Interesting. Always something new and exciting. All right, so welcome to Revelation class number 2, and glad to have everybody back that's able to be with us. For those that are new this time and that were in the class a few years ago, you will see a lot of similarities. However, it's not going to be an exact repeat. Just about every slide is going to have either a new verse or a new tweak here or there. So hopefully it won't be a complete repeat for you. All right, so we are working through the introductory lesson, and we're going through the questions, just trying to get a foundation to go into the text. Hope to finish that pretty quickly this evening, and then get into actually chapter 1 and get most of chapter 1 done. So very quickly, based on your reading, the introduction, your experience with the book, what are the major prominent themes that you see throughout the book? Or that you're aware of?
God's in complete control and judgment always can be in favor of the saints.
All right, very good. So God being in control, He's going to exercise judgment. It's going to be in favor of the saints. May not be right away that it's in favor, but eventually it is going to be. Ultimately, that's going to be the case. Any other prominent themes that jump out at you?
Christ is the Lamb, the worthy Lamb, and now being exalted.
All right, very good. So that's one thing that we see is a huge theme, and it's very appropriate because in the eyes and minds of many, maybe even those, especially those who would not be Christians, think back to the Mount of Transfiguration. They would be thinking of Jesus as this weak, this fleshly person, just a human being. And what we're going to see in this book is a lot like the Mount of Transfiguration. He's so much more. And so we're seeing him in this kind of exalted, glorified, even if it's figurative, it is still a higher state than, even though we know it, we may forget about it, and so it's a good reminder. And it certainly enriches our understanding of him. Anything else? All right, those are all very good. So the sovereignty of God, actually war, the word for war shows up more in Revelation than any other New Testament book. The fact that God's righteous, there is a vindication of God's righteousness that I think shows up. It's not a major theme per se, but it is something that comes up, especially as it relates to the questions that people would naturally have about God. The worthiness of the Lamb, as Jesse mentioned. But now this is kind of an ironic one. We're going to see the love of God actually show up quite a bit as well. So that's one that I want you to be on the lookout for because it's not as prominent as some of the other themes. But I want you to be thinking about how God's love is demonstrated throughout the book of Revelation. And I think you'll find it there as well. And then Haley actually stresses this in his commentary and introduction, and it's a very good point. This is an epistle, just like any other New Testament epistle, and it is a persuasive work. It's intended to drive change in you, to transform you. It's not supposed to be, oh, by the way, FYI, here's some information you might be interested in. This is supposed to be something that is persuasive, that changes you, and that ultimately you have to obey. So that's one of the other things I want you to keep in mind. Primarily the thing that jumps out, being faithful unto death. Faithfulness to Christ, faithfulness to God is not always easy. It's going to require commitment and obedience. And so Paul Earnhardt, in his lesson series, he stresses the questions that Revelation answers. Does God see? Does he know? Does he care? Is he doing anything about it? What's going on? So for those who were focused on and very much rightfully affected by the loss of their loved ones, by the persecution that would be hurting people, killing people in very cruel and gruesome ways, that's going to naturally cause people to ask these very questions and wonder, what in the world is God doing about it? So these are the things that Revelation is going to address, and you're going to see that come up again and again. All right, so we're going to come back to these themes. The last question is like, what is the theme? And we'll see if we can kind of boil that down. But let's take a break and look at numbers, how they're used in this book. Do you have any idea or any thoughts on how numbers are used throughout the book of Revelation? Is
the number 7 crop up many, many times, representing their completeness, perfection.
Okay.
Something just having come to fullness.
Okay, good. Good.
Going along with that 3.5 being half the 7.
All right, very good. So a 7 that's been kind of interrupted or broken in some way. One thing I want you to keep in mind is you see things halved. Don't think of it as it's a half. This is not representative of, oh, this is 50%. So a great example of this is think about the parable of the 10 virgins. Remember, there was 5 wise and 5 foolish. This is a representation of all of humanity. Is he saying that half of the people are going to go to heaven and half the people are going to hell? No. It's telling you that some portion of humanity is going to do what's right, and some portion of humanity is not. They're going to do what's wrong. Some's going to be wise, some's going to be foolish. All it's telling you is that it's a fraction. It's not giving you any insight into the relative size of the two pieces, of the two fractions to each other. So, just because you see it cut in half, don't think that it's actually cut in half. It's just a portion. All right, any other numbers jump out at you? Go ahead, Kayla. I heard you first.
10 is another number of completion.
All right. 10 is another like completion or perfection number. Good. What else?
I think of 6, because it's just short of 7.
All right, good. So 6 would be kind of the imperfect number, the incomplete number. All right, good. So I think for the most part, almost every number in this book is going to be figurative. I think you will be hard-pressed to find literal ones. They're going to be the exception. And so just there's so many of them, it's going to make it very difficult to pick out the ones that are actually literal. A lot of these are ones that we're very familiar with. Think about one. One just being the idea of unity, solidarity, or just being unique. So in Revelation 17:13, we're going to talk about the different minds and kings related to the beast that have the same mind. They're of one mind. They're united in this one purpose. Think about Genesis 11:6, Tower of Babel. God said, we see that the people are one. They are of one mind, they have one language, and now nothing's going to be withheld from them. So this idea of unity. John 10:30 as well as 17:22 about God the Father and Jesus being one, us being one with them. Again, it's a number, but what's he talking about? Is he talking about that we all are wearing like the number 1 on our jersey? No. What he means is we're united. We have the same mind or the same thought. And 1 Corinthians 3:8 being another example of God's workers being one. That's also mentioned there. 2, being the idea of reinforcement. So I think probably one of the ideal passages for this is Ecclesiastes 4:9-11. Remember, if one's alone, easily overcome, but if there's 2 together, not so easily, because one can pick the other one up, warm the other one. They're able to work together. So 2 being a representation of reinforcement or just kind of confidence, kind of figuratively from that idea. So Luke 10:1, how are the disciples sent out? 2 by 2. Why not 1? Because they need each other. The same principle that's expressed in Ecclesiastes 4. Deuteronomy 17:6 and 19:15. Remember, at the mouth of how many witnesses? How many does it take to put somebody to death? 2 or 3. You got to have at least 2. You got to be sure. You've got to have some corroboration. It can't just be one person standing up. So 2 Corinthians 13:1 uses the same idea. Zechariah 4 is a vision where you see these 2 branches or these 2 lampstands. And it's a representation of the high priest and the king or the governor. So the 2 different offices that bear the burden of God's government for the Jews. All right, 3, that seems like it's a pretty obvious reference to the deity, to the Godhead. But as time's gone by, I've actually gone further and further away from that. Most of the emphasis is actually just the repetition. Just the fact that you see something 3 times. So, holy, holy, holy. Remember, they didn't have italics. They didn't have highlighting. They didn't have bold and underlining. If they wanted to emphasize something, they had to repeat it. And that was the only way they could get that across. And that works really well because Hebrew, Greek, English, we get the emphasis. And we wouldn't have got it if it had been conveyed the other ways. So, God being described as 3 times holy. So we'll see that in chapter 4:8. And then in 8:13, you see woe, woe, woe. So tremendous devastation, tremendous suffering. Again, the idea of it being emphasized. Isaiah 6:3 is holy. And then these are the only places where you see this triple repetition of some word. The other one's in Jeremiah 22:29 where he says earth, earth, earth. And that's a very interesting one, because if earth has to do with false religion, then the verse that follows this in chapter 30 is the one that says that Coniah is going to go into captivity and his children will never sit on the throne and prosper, which kills premillennialism. So it's almost like he's calling out religion, religion, religion. This man, this is broken. This will not work. And so there may be an incredible sharp sting to that reference as well that I had not seen before. All right, so there's your 3.5. I'm just going through them in order here. 4, think about, there's many, many references to the 4 winds of heaven or the 4 corners of the earth. So think about a map with the 4 corners, right? The remotest outside reaches of a map describing all the world, or a compass, northeast, southwest, right? So you'll have the 4 winds of heaven. So these always have to do with the breadth, the remotest, the far reaches, the whole world. And so 4 often represents that. 5, as I mentioned, the parable of the 10 virgins, the 5 wise and 5 foolish. This is just a broken or interrupted 10. Not very common. 6 is also not very common, but it does show up. The most notorious one, 666. So the idea of 6 is the day of creation. That's the first time where you see the number in the Bible. That's the day that man was created. So it becomes a representation for man. And then, as Andrew brought up, it reminds you of Romans 3:23 as well, like falling short of perfection. All have sinned and fallen short. 6 falls short of 7. So 7 being the day that God said, it's enough. I'm going to rest now. So 7 representing a kind of perfection, if you will, but nuanced in the direction of it's God saying it's enough. This is a representation of God saying, either placing a limit or saying that it has reached perfection in some way. And the basis of this figure being in creation in Genesis 2. So 10 would be another kind of perfection number. Again, the nuanced difference, though, is instead of God setting the limit, human is setting the limit. Man is setting the limit. And it seems to come from our 10 fingers, our 10 toes. Think about an agricultural military society. Your fingers were really important, a lot more important than they are to us now. You would not be able to be as a capable farmer, soldier, etc. without all of your fingers. So the idea being that 10, and this is what our numbering system is based off of, our 10 fingers and 10 toes. That's the reason we have a 10-based numbering system. So the idea being this represents like kind of human peak capacity, power, the maximum that human beings can do, kind of our limit, if you will. So both 7 and 10 representing kind of completion or perfection, but one being established by God, limited by God, the other one being limited inherently by man. And then 12, where's the first time you see 12 in the Bible? 12 tribes, right? And then that ends up standing for all of God's people. All the 12 tribes, that's all of God's people. And then when we get to the New Testament, we see it repeated with the 12 apostles. In fact, Jesus says, you're going to sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So he actually reinforces that image with the tribes, with God's apostles. All right. So, and then lastly, you will see a lot of big numbers that are just these smaller numbers multiplied together. And all that's doing is just kind of mingling the meaning between these, or emphasizing. Maybe we see 10 3 times for 1,000. Or we see 12 times 12, and then that times 10 times 10 times 10. So these can be combined to mingle meaning or just to emphasize the meaning. All right, any questions on these? All right, so let's see if we can just kind of wrap this up real quick. Major outline here. the major sections. The first one, chapters 1 through 3, is the introduction. And then Christ begins judgment by judging his lampstands, his churches. And then we get into the bigger part. So chapters 4 through 7, we have the unveiling, the unleashing of the 7 seals. And so God's plan is revealed. And then next we have the 7 trumpets. And then we kind of have like a backstory kind of flashback. It's like the whole thing gets put on pause and we take a step back to introduce or to better understand some of the characters that are at play here. And we have a set of characters who are going to kind of march into the movie, the picture, if you will, almost. And then at the end of the book, they're going to march right back out in reverse order. Well, they're not going to march out. But anyway, they're going to be led out in reverse order. So the last one in will be the first one out. All right, so then we get back to the 7 bowls. And so at this point, we're executing final wrath. No more partial judgments, no more warning. This is it. And then we have in the chapter 17 through 20, these characters that I was talking about. We see their destruction, the end of all of those. And then we have really the conclusion in chapters 20 through 22 of eternal judgment, scenes of heaven, and then just kind of the final invitation of the book. All right, there is a lot that you can do with this structurally. This is not something that I spend a lot of time with, but as you look at these 7s, you'll notice that they always come in 4, and then there's like an interlude, and then there's 3. Revelation, from just a purely structural standpoint, think like poetry, is very interesting, and that's not something I've really delved into. I know other people have, but if you're looking for that, especially if you're looking at the original, you'll find things that you wouldn't see, possibly even in translations. All right, so just a few quick reminders. Remember, first of all, this applied to them. So don't take what you think is neat and convenient and helpful for you and then try to force that back on them. Start with what's helpful for them and then make application to yourself. That's going to help keep us out of the weeds so that we don't end up coming up with applications that were never intended. Very similar. This book is based on code that was established by Daniel, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Joel, Isaiah. Don't figure out what you think Revelation means and what you think all these symbols are and then try to push that back into these other books. They had their own meaning and their own interpretation independent of Revelation long before Revelation came about. Revelation is based on them, not the other way around. Again, it's going to help keep us out of the weeds so that we start with them instead of starting with Revelation. And then just general advice, make sure that you always interpret the clear passages first and then use that as anchors to drive the more difficult ones. Don't start in Revelation and use that to drive your understanding of the rest of the Bible. So, and then this one's got a couple of points in it. Don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. Don't fixate on details at the expense of the primary point in any one scene. So the primary point is going to be very clear. So don't get frustrated and don't lose sight of that or forget about that trying to work out some kind of little nuanced detail. Make sure that you always see the main point and don't get discouraged by not being able to figure out what one little detail is. And the other thing is not every detail has meaning independently. Some of the details are there just to provide emphasis to the main point. And it's not really a separate point in and of itself. So just be careful, kind of like parables. Don't make too much out of it. So a really good example is I remember somebody making a point of the parable of the 100 sheep. When the shepherd puts the sheep on his back and carries them out, they said that proved Calvinism. Because Jesus picked the sheep up and the sheep didn't do anything. It just got carried. All right? Making way too much out of the parable. That's not the point. So don't make that mistake in these as well. And then come to terms with the fact that when we finish this class, I know I'm not going to have all the answers to all the questions. Maybe you will, but I won't. So there'll still be some specifics, some details that we're not going to be able to get worked out quite right. That's okay. The main point, the main applications will be very clear. So again, don't let that become a source of discouragement and drop the most important treasure because of this little gem or little jewel here. That's still valuable, but don't give everything away for that. All right, any questions about this. One last one. So what do you think's the most important theme, the overall message? Since we've been talking about keeping the overall message clear, how would you put it in your words? And there's not going to be an exact right answer because human beings are not going to do a great job of summarizing what God said in so many more words.
Thank God and Jesus' victory is assured. Make sure you're on their side.
Good. So they're going to win. Make sure that you're on their side. If you're not, you're going to lose. All right, what else?
I just thought about what you had on the front of the book, trust God. That seems like a big theme throughout.
Yep. So when I taught this last time, I focused on God's righteousness and encouraging saints. Here lately, as I've been trying to come up with themes for classes, I've been focusing on what I think is the primary application. And so I wanted to condense that down, and I think the primary application is you're supposed to trust God. All of these things provide either support for us trusting God, this is why we should trust Him, or it's an extension built on that. It's an application of that. Because you trust God, be faithful unto death. That's how you're going to be faithful unto death. So just a quick way to answer this, a lot of different commentaries and books. I like their titles. Those are good summaries. Ray Summers' commentary, Worthy is the Lamb. The Florida College Lectures, they call theirs Overcoming with the Lamb. Hendrickson called his More Than Conquerors, which is a quotation from Romans 8. And then Paul Earnhardt called his Visions of Victory. So another way to say it, Jesus has already won. Will you win with Him? Answering the questions that we brought up earlier. God's in control. Judgment is coming. It may not look like it, but it is. So be faithful unto death. Trust God. All right. So let's get into the actual text now itself. So the first question I had for you all as we get into Revelation 1 is it introduces itself with the revelation of Jesus Christ. Grammatically, this could refer to either a message about Jesus or a message from Jesus. For you Greek folks, I think this may be genitive in this case. But I haven't looked at this in a long time. From the context, can you tell which meaning is intended? Is it about Jesus or is it from Jesus? And if so, what are the implications? I'm going to answer this one. I almost took this one out. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and do this. I think it's actually a message from, because that's what the context and the grammar leads itself to. We have God giving a message to Jesus. Jesus shows it to the angel, and then the angel shows it to the apostle, and then the apostle is providing. We have the chain of authority, a chain of command there. That seems to be the context. The other thing is which God gave him to show is synonymous with the things which must shortly take place. That's two ways of describing the same thing. Jesus himself is not a thing that's supposed to shortly take place. So grammatically, if you just diagram the sentence, it doesn't allow you to actually say it's a revelation of Jesus himself. That being said, you do very much see Jesus. He is a central figure of the book, and we see him in a way that we did not see him in the epistles. So that's fair to think about it in that way. And so this is just a common question a lot of people ask. And so I wanted to go over it. And even if you think of it as a revelation about Jesus, that is perfectly fine. And that is a valid thought and a valid lesson to pull from this book. So I don't know there's a lot of value in one versus the other. But so that's why I'm going to probably pull it out of it next time I teach this class. But any thoughts on it before we leave this question?
Just on the implications of being from Christ, this shows that it was divine, directly from God, and we need to keep heed to it, which got highlighted in verse 3.
Yep, very good. All right, we've talked about this one in the introduction. I want to focus on this one real quick. How does the time frame impact the various views that we talked about last time?
If these prophecies are shortly going to take place, it can't be like talking about the Catholic Church and stuff that some people think it does.
All right, so that's going to rule out which one?
I can't remember.
All right, so the continuous historical, the idea that this is history being unfolded specifically over time. This is a record of like the Dark Ages, the Catholic Church, Islam, you name it. All of history is specifically either mentioned or alluded to. And that's going to knock that out. Any other ones?
If you're one who believes that this was referring to the Jewish destruction of Jerusalem, destruction of Jerusalem, then that would mean it would have to be just a few years before that happened.
Which is why they take the early date. They're basically forced into the early date because of their view of the book. All right? How about for the futurist, the one who wants to take it literally and say that it's 2,000 years away?
Well, what happened to that plan?
Yeah, exactly. All right, so shortly take place. The time is near. So this puts all these things very close by. And so this is going to eliminate the futurists. And I think it's also going to eliminate the idealist who's saying that these are vague or general principles that are kind of constantly always applying, because it would kind of never really apply more at one time versus another. The fact that it has a very near specific application, I think also eliminates the more vague, the more generic idealist position as well. All right. For the sake of time, it's a very similar point. We talked about the signified last time. Remember, signify is always used with one possible exception, even though I think it's still figurative there as well. It's always used in reference to figurative speech. Acts 25:27 being the possible exception. And this knocks out the futurist who's looking at this as literal interpretation. It's a literal dragon, it's literal stars falling, literal sun falling, all of those things. And so understanding that this is actually something that's been signified or symbolized, communicated figuratively, is going to knock out that position. So, I mean, if we're being honest with that, that really narrows the field as far as what the possible interpretations are very significantly. But alas. All right, so let's get into the text itself. So how is Jesus described in this greeting, and how would this help the first century Christians?
He's described as faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, ruler of kings of the earth, the one who loves us and has released us.
All right. So how do you think those would help?
Because he's letting them know that Christ witnesses their persecution, and he's faithful. He's not going to forget them. He's going to represent them properly. He's the firstborn from the dead, so that
Death is temporary.
it's temporary, and they're going to follow after him in the resurrection as well.
Yep. Good.
And ruler of kings of the earth, just kind of reassuring them that he's in control.
Right. Nobody's usurped him, taken over. This is not outside of his plan.
I mean, there's kind of that terminology of he's gone on before us. He was the firstborn from the dead. We need to follow him. The victory is already won, which is one of the themes throughout the book.
Yep, very good. So if you dig into it detail, a lot of these things are actually very helpful. The fact that he's the Christ, this is the Messiah, this is the person who is fulfilling all of the prophecy, all of the story, all of the legacy that is tied to the Messiah, who that is. So he's the Savior of prophecy, the fulfilled prophecies, the faithful witness. So it's interesting, the word for witness is actually the word martyr. Now, Marshall was saying in our Greek class that it's a little bit later, and maybe even after Revelation, that the word martyr maybe actually, the word that's witness, is actually comes to be associated with the witness through death. Like they gave witness by giving their life up. That's the association that comes in. And it's uncertain if that's here at this point or if that's a little bit later. So I'd always thought that it was already established by this point, but Marshall indicated it may not be clear if that association is there. But certainly that's the case. That same reason for that association is still true, even if that wasn't a common association by that point. So he was faithful unto death, himself the firstborn of the dead, so he conquered, he was resurrected, ruler of the kings of the earth. We talked about this power over the earthly empires. He loves us. So again, him who loved us. So this is one of the places where we see God caring for us and explaining the motivation for the other things we see. But then, why did he do this? How did he show his love? By sacrificing himself, by washing us from our sins in his own blood. And then he has a reward for us. He's made us kings and priests to his God and Father. I think New American Standard and I think the NT text is going to have made us a kingdom and priest. But very similar ideas that you've got a reward of authority and a very heavenly task to help save others. And then being worthy of praise, and which ultimately provides hope, courage, and confidence. So this is a very rich description. I mean, every single part of how he explains himself would have been rich in meaning and encouragement and hope to the people that are suffering persecution and watching the people around them die as they're suffering persecution. All right, he says in verse 7 that he is coming with clouds and every eye will see him, even they who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn because of him. Even so, amen. So, this sure sounds like the end of the world, right? I mean, isn't that what they said in Acts 1, that how you saw him leave, you're going to see him return? This is very often associated with the day of the Lord. People think about this being the end of the world. So is it? Is this really talking about the end of the world? Is Jesus coming, as recorded here in verse 7? Does this have to refer to the end of the world? Why? Why not? And I gave you a little tip by looking at the day of the Lord. Very closely associated with it.
It is the coming of the Lord, but it's not the second coming.
All right. All right, good. Any evidence to help point us in that way? I believe that's correct.
In the prophets, the day of the Lord and the coming of the Lord is used to refer to judgment, but not necessarily worldwide judgment. It's used to refer to specific judgments on specific nations.
All right, very good. Good. So this is something that's not commonly known or understood, but if you spend a lot of time, whether it's in Revelation or the Old Testament prophets, you're going to figure out pretty quickly that the idea of coming in clouds, coming in judgment, the day of the Lord, all of this terminology, even the things about the sun being darkened and stars falling and mountains falling, those are all figurative expressions that are used for the destruction of nations and cities, specifically called out, the burden to Babylon, woe upon Egypt. We know because the prophet himself used that language and said this applies to Egypt, it applies to Babylon. So the idea is that it's any day where God acts in a very sweeping or a very noticeable way. God steps in and he renders judgment. And that's always going to have kind of two faces to it, depending on who you are. And I think a great example of that is how the angel of the Lord stepped in between Egypt and the children of Israel at the Red Sea. Remember, he was the pillar of cloud to the Israelites, so they saw something friendly, but it was, I may have that wrong. It was different, but I can't remember now how it was different. And the Egyptians, did they see fire or did they see a cloud?
I thought the Egyptians saw fire because it led them in light with their path. I may have that backwards.
I think I've got it backwards. But anyway, the Israelites saw one thing and the Egyptians saw the other thing. And the day of the Lord is kind of similar in a similar kind of way. If you're righteous, then you're going to be freed from and liberated from your oppressors and from the evil people that have been mistreating you. So it's good. If you're wicked, it's destruction.
Cloud by day, fire by night.
Well, but at that time, it actually came right in between them. And at the same time, it created two different environments for the two different people. And I've forgotten which way it actually went.
Verse 20 of Exodus 14 says, it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. This was a cloud of darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other.
All right, very good. So you got two different effects to the two different camps. And this is that same kind of idea, is that you've got different effects for these people. All right, so Egypt, it's used in Egypt. Here's the references. We're not going to dig into each one of these. I'm going to leave this for you to go look at later. Day of the Lord's used in Egypt, Babylon, Edom, Israel, Judah, Jerusalem. All of these are very specifically called out, very similar language that we see. And it makes sense, because if you were in that nation and this judgment was falling, it would be the end of the world. Everything that you knew, everything that you loved would be destroyed. I mean, just imagine if something happened and we woke up tomorrow and 9/10 of everybody was gone. And 9/10 of everything was destroyed. Just 10% was left of everything. We would feel like we were in an apocalypse. We were in a zombie, like, end of the world. It would feel like Armageddon, or, like I said, the apocalypse. So this language is very fitting for those people who actually went through this, because for them it was the end of their world. All right, but it is actually used of the end of the world. I think Acts 1 that we talked about. But it's also used about God coming in judgment and establishing the church as well. Joel 2 is a very clear example that's actually called out as a specific fulfillment in Acts 2. So there's no question about that. So looking at 7 real quick, which one of these could it be? It can't be Egypt, it can't be Babylon, all those things are past. So we've really got 3 possible candidates. Destruction of Jerusalem. It was used in that way. It could be the destruction of Rome, or it could be the establishment of the church. So let's look at the church. Zechariah has in chapter 12:10 through 13:1, he has very similar language that's about the establishment of the church. It's a really good candidate. It fits pretty well, except for we know the church has already been established by the time we get to Revelation 1, obviously. The kingdom has already been established. Mark 9 and Acts 1 and Acts 2 make that clear. Colossians 1:13, Paul saying that we're already in the kingdom. We've been conveyed past tense into that. So that doesn't fit, even though the language is very similar. How about destruction of Jerusalem? Very similar language. Jesus coming in the clouds, every eye seeing him, all the tribes of the earth mourning. Jesus makes this same prophecy himself in Matthew 24. But this is something that I think that's already passed. Mark 14, he uses the same language when he's talking to the high priest, and he says, "You will see me come in clouds." So it can't possibly be the end of the world, because it's something that had to happen while this high priest was still alive. This is a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, that he would see God coming in judgment, Jesus coming in judgment against Jerusalem and against him. Is the process. So I don't think it's a fit. Could it be Rome? Well, it's interesting because John actually quotes this verse from Zechariah that we looked at. So we have Zechariah being applied to 3 different groups. It's applied to the establishment of the church, destruction of Jerusalem, and Rome as well. So I think this fits much better in keeping with the idea that at this point Rome is the primary villain. It is the persecuting power. And so just like that language, this end of the world language is kind of figuratively being applied over and over again to the fall of each of these kingdoms. Jerusalem, Rome, I think it applies here as well. So we have this kind of like, if you will, a second or third fulfillment of Zechariah in Rome, as evidenced by John 19 here, 31 through 37. All right, that's my thoughts. What do you think? Questions, comments? So the key takeaway, I know that was a lot to just kind of go through. The key takeaway is that language can be used, has been used for the destruction of lots of different things. So at this point in time, what's the best fit? Jerusalem, the establishment of the church, or Rome? If you don't take the early date, then Jerusalem's off the table. And the church is gone too. So you're only left with one choice, is Rome. And it's a valid candidate because John quotes it and applies it to Rome, to the Roman soldiers specifically in John 19. All right, we will pick up with verse 8 and question number 6 next time and get into John and where he was with these visions. Thank you all for your preparation and your participation. Looking forward to next time.